Hi everyone, I'm Tim from UrbanLogiq. Thanks for joining us. Our topic today is, so your agency received an SS4A action plan grant. Now what? In this webinar, we'll be covering the components of an effective action plan, some of the challenges faced in safety data analysis, and how technology can be used to push a safety plan forward. Before we get started, one quick housekeeping item. This is an on-demand webinar that's been pre-recorded for your viewing pleasure and leisure. So while it's not live, we do encourage you to still ask questions through the Q&A chat box and we'll respond following the webinar. So here's a quick look at the agenda ahead. I'll introduce our panelists, provide a quick overview of the SS4A program, and then dive right into discussion. Our panelists today bring three unique perspectives and focuses of expertise to feed into hopefully a lively discussion on developing effective action plans. So joining me today, we have Brian Chandler.
I'm the Director of Transportation Safety at DKS Associates in Seattle, and happy to be here to talk about safety planning and also the incorporation of technology into safety analysis and identification of projects for improving safety.
Hi, my name is Leah Hanvey. I head of business development at UrbanLogiq. At UrbanLogiq, we're a tech company that focuses on building better communities with data. So I am thrilled to be here today to talk about the SS4A and how to use data to drive safety outcomes for your communities.
I'm Seth, the Chief Innovation Officer of Michelin's Mobility Intelligence business. I'm responsible for a combination of strategy and innovation for the creation of new products and businesses that are centered on harnessing data. At Michelin, safety is at the heart of what we do, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very excited to be part of this panel.
If you're tuning in today, you're probably already familiar with the broad strokes of the program, so I don't want to linger too long on this. For anyone wanting to do a deeper dive into the fundamentals of the program, there are some useful resources out there that we'll provide a link to, including a recent webinar by the Federal Highway Administration. So Safe Streets and Roads for All, or SS4A, is a $5 billion grant program that's been dominating headlines in this space since it was announced almost a year ago. The focus of SS4A is for communities to take a proactive approach to road safety and propagate Vision Zero goals. That's reflected in the eligible activities, as you can see here: developing or updating a comprehensive safety action plan, conducting activities to support an action plan, carrying out projects and strategies identified in an action plan. There are two streams to this funding: action plan grants and implementation grants. And our focus today will be on the action plan grants. The primary deliverables of an action plan grant is, you've guessed it, a publicly available action plan. Firstly, leadership commitment and goal setting. The commitment must include a target for achieving zero roadway fatalities or serious injuries, or an ambitious reduction of roadway fatalities and serious injuries by a specific date. Ambitious is yet to be defined, and to some extent, it's up to the agency involved as to what they're setting as an ambitious target. So secondly, within the planning structure itself, you need a committee charged with oversight of the action plan development, implementation, and monitoring. Moving on to the planning inputs, the first one is safety analysis. This is analysis of existing conditions, historical trends, and creating a baseline of the level of crashes involving fatalities and serious injuries across a jurisdiction. So next is engagement and collaboration. Engagement with the public and relevant stakeholders, including the private sector and community groups, that allows for both community representation and also feedback. So next is equity considerations. So plan development must have inclusive and representative processes. Underserved communities must be identified through data and other analyses. Moving on to the outcomes of the SS4A action plan. Next is policy and process changes. So here it's an assessment of current policies, plans, guidelines, standards to identify opportunities to improve how processes prioritize transportation safety. Following on, we have strategy and project selections. This is the identification of a comprehensive set of projects and strategies that focus on a safe system approach and is shaped by data. As part of this, moving on to the next one is prioritization. That means once you've identified that comprehensive set of projects, you can prioritize them by timeline for deployment. And finally, a crucial part of the action plan is progress and transparency. Agencies need a method to measure progress over time. To include outcome data, they need transparency with stakeholders and the public, and that will likely be the form of accessible reporting on progress. The program recently announced its first round of awardees, so that's $800 million across 510 projects. Of those, the vast majority were action plan grants, so that's 472 action plan grants and 37 implementation grants. We anticipate that the next NOFO, so for the financial year 2023, will be released imminently, with applications due in summer. And off the back of that, there's some anticipation that there'll be some refining of the NOFO based on lessons learned from the first year. So your agency received an SS4A action plan grant. Now what? Since the awards, we've been engaging with hundreds of awardees to hear their concerns and challenges, and we're here to cut through the noise and talk through some of the common questions that are coming up, as well as give you some ideas as what makes a high quality action plan. So let's turn things over now to our panel. We're still in relatively early stages of the SS4A. I'd be intrigued to get your takes on the process so far.
Looking at the awards that we found out in February, based on some of the work that we had done at DKS, I was maybe a little bit of surprise to find that both the implementation grants were pretty hard to win, right? That only went to a relatively small number of agencies with pretty large applications, generally speaking. And then on the other hand, most of what we're going to talk about, I think the most today, is that the action plan grants were, from what I understand, everyone who submitted one was awarded. So there's a lot of money on the action plan side. And I think that was a pleasant surprise for all of us to see the kind of opportunities that we have now in action plan development.
So I think one of the really exciting things is how much of an opportunity this presents to different agencies to tap into, unconventional or non-traditional approaches to action plans that were not previously accessible to them. So experimenting with data analytics a little bit more in depth, experimenting with novel data sources like crowdsourced and all the sources that I'm sure Seth can certainly add into and chime into, but also, talking about, and I think we're going to talk about this quite a bit today, is thinking about changing the way we think about action plans instead of a print it once on paper and then it's outdated, but instead taking a much more dynamic and evergreen lifelong approach to these action plans. I think what's also going to be really interesting is, since everyone is now set up so well to achieve a really impactful and meaty action plan, which ones of these are going to go on to inform the next round of implementation grants? And so I think for agencies looking to achieve the next, wave of those things, is when you enter into your action plan is always to think about how this might inform future grant opportunities, because there's not just the SS4A as well, but there's SMART grants. There's so many different vehicles of funding that are available, more so than ever before. And so now it's a really great opportunity to be innovative, to push the boat out a little bit, take some risks. And then I think from there, agencies will surprise themselves by what they're able to accomplish with this amount of money.
I do think it's very exciting, and certainly in seeing some of these grants, I do think that we're going to see that agencies are going to be able to do things that perhaps they weren't able to do before, and push the needle a little further in terms of safe mobility.
With 40% of the $5 billion over the next 5 years going to planning activities alone, there's clearly a big focus on, as Leah said, trying things out that maybe people haven't done before, giving people a good solid base. Because while this action plan grant does feed naturally into the implementation plan, so implementation grant, there's clearly as well, it's just good practice. What they're advocating in the action plan, a lot of it's just good practice that will feed into most federal funding programs. It's a good baseline. With regards to that, once in a generation that's often touted as a tagline for this funding, what should agencies keep in mind when they're looking to make the most of that, when they're looking to maximize that value?
I think when agencies are, trying to maximize this amount of money, one thing that can't be understated right now is the mechanisms of this funding. There is a 20% match, for example. And so one thing that we have to talk about is that a lot of agencies now have to look at this 20% match and being able to fund that internally in order to unlock a lot of this other funding. Now, there are interesting ways that we can talk about how to address that match. There are other eligible activities and in-kind supports that can contribute to that 20%. So work with your vendors, work with your consultant partners, and think about, these are the outcomes that I want to achieve for my agency. This is the vision that I have for my agency. And then you can align resources internally and also get a little bit creative with some of your partners about how to really attack those outcomes in a very meaningful, action-oriented way. I think one of the things that can be understated as well is that the speed to which agencies should start to think about how to get this funding in motion. I know that, right now the US DOT is in the process of executing all of these agreements with different agencies across the country. So one thing that, is also a very real opportunity is how can different agencies work with their next door neighbors, work with their MPOs, work with their other colleagues in different agencies to pool funding, to strike single agreements that cover multiple agencies and jurisdictions, to increase the buying power on things like technologies, on data sets and things like that. And also, how do they, as we all know, mobility doesn't obey political boundaries. It's especially for such of the interconnected regions in which we live right now, safety has to be a team sport. So one of the things that is really powerful, I think, about this data set, about this grant opportunity, is a means of collaboration with other agencies as well, and coming up with regional and interconnected safety solutions to drive and save lives for everyone, for all road users.
Yes, we've been, or some have been calling this a once in a generation opportunity. I think that's true up to this point. I've been a safety engineer now for almost 25 years. My hope is that that's not true for my own career, that this is the one time that we have this influx of funds. And I think we do have both the opportunity, and then with that, not to be too cheesy, the responsibility to use this big chunk of money that we're going to have over the next 5 years, and then to implement that over the next X number of years. So that we are able to see real, true outcomes in reducing fatal and serious injury crashes, and thus are able to show that, hey, if we use these new methods, if we identify these projects that we believe can work, when they do work, then we can get those investments again.
Picking up on the point that Leah referenced around match funding, most of these awards, based on the recommended amount, they suggested people have $200,000 of budget. So most people applied for that. Most grants are for $2,000 or more. With the match funding requirement of 20%, that means that potentially up to $40,000 is needed in match funding for some of these relatively small agencies. How do you think people can get to that match target? What part do you think private sector can play in partnering with the public sector agencies to get that match funding?
Readily available funds to meet this match might be attainable for some and might not be attainable for others. So this is where the in-kind contributions come in. So I know that, Seth and UrbanLogiq, so Michelin and UrbanLogiq, we have kind of in-kind programs where we can work with agencies and provide services as an in-kind contribution to this grant. And that is monetized and can be basically tallied in the municipality, the agency contributing to that 20%. Seth could certainly talk about maybe some examples of, places where that's come in, or how data can contribute to this piece, because that is data is oftentimes a big hurdle. And I think that we saw especially in the applications, we only really know so much as like what the application looked like and what the selection process looked like. Everything else is completely brand new for absolutely everyone. So we're still figuring it out too. But what this has shown us up until now is that data has to be a critical piece in this action plan and in the implementation. Otherwise, you're just not going to get an implementation grant if you don't have the data. And then a second piece is that for achieving the eligible activities within the action plan grant is that data is also a fundamental piece, and data that's not necessarily tracking the things that DOTs were set up to track as normal, right? It's not just going to be your traffic counts. It's not going to just be your crash records. And, especially the work that Brian does in analyzing and providing safety strategies for communities is that safety is more than just historical crash. In fact, historical crashes are the worst predictor ever of future crashes, right? It's all about the context. It's all about the community and the situation in which crashes happen. So, and as that changes, that's how you can make that more an embedded piece within your crash prediction and your crash forecasting. But one of the things that I think UrbanLogiq is very interested in is seeing how equity and climate action have been so central as well in the safety piece, and that's something that you don't really see very often in historical safety grants as well. Seth, maybe you want to speak a little bit about your data piece.
Kind of been brewing on this for a while, but maybe we need to kind of rethink some of the metrics and the way that we've been measuring things, because like you say, I mean, the things that we're measuring aren't necessarily the measurements that we need to have to get to where we want to go. And so as we start looking at Vision Zero and safety plans and everything else, what are those metrics, and really what are we measuring to make sure that we get to where we want to go? And so I think as we talk about some of the obstacles, when I think about a common barrier that I've heard is that organizations are often limited by the quality and the breadth of the data they're using to inform their safety plans. And indeed, as you've mentioned, Leah, the crash data is certainly a major and important indicator, but it's just one dimension. And crash data has been the data source for decades when we think about a lot of safety plans. And so when we look at the situation that we see today with crash fatalities and with incidents involving pedestrians and vulnerable road users, it's quite clear to me, at least, and to many of the people I've spoken to in the public sector, that crash data just isn't enough. And so this leads us to the challenge, right? There's a lot of data out there, other types of data, and various solution providers making this or that claim. And so I think the challenge that the public sector has is in deciding, what data is actually appropriate, what data is credible, and what can actually make a difference. Because the last thing we need is just data for the sake of it. The thing that we really need is something that is actionable. We need to take this data and turn it into an insight and something that makes sense of it all, and that we can then measure to make sure that we're really achieving what it is we need to achieve to make the world a safer place.
Many agencies will be looking for private sector support to develop their action plans. And a lot of awardees won't have gone through this process before. What are initial steps to keep in mind when preparing a scope of work?
It's a generally larger chunk of funding than we've often had for safety planning. So thinking through within SS4A, what are the contractual realities of this? What must you do on the contract side? And really the solution to that is just staying in contact with your Federal Highway Division office. But that's going to be your connection to this funding program. That's going to be your connection to USDOT. There's going to be some specific solicitation requirements related to competition, et cetera. So just keeping an eye on those. And then also the time period. You'll have X amount of time to complete the action plan. So just being sure you're adhering to those and following the rules, basically, and understanding what those rules are. The second piece of that is the content, the notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, the other guidance, all the webinars from last year help define what the action plan must include. And some of those are things that we're used to doing in local road safety plans over the last forever, but some of them are fairly new. So looking at demographic analysis, that equity piece that we've talked about, really truly doing meaningful community outreach, understanding what the needs of your community and your stakeholders are. That is something a little bit different than some of our local road safety plans that might have been mostly focused on the Highway Safety Improvement Program, HSIP, in the past. Those are math programs, like those are distributed mathematically to every state. The SS4A work, the action plans that we're developing are designed to be more comprehensive. So it's not just a math and science problem anymore. It's also a social problem. It's also a community, bringing the people in, understanding better what those, again, comprehensively, what your safety needs might be. And then it also includes a policy assessment. So I think that be sure you're looking not only at look at our safety problem based on all this data, identify a bunch of projects and then move forward, but also thinking about what are the policies, procedures, practices in your agency that should be looked at and addressed. Examples of that might be, how are you handling speed? What does your speed management program look like? How do you assess your posted speed limits? There's new research. There are new ways to do that better than we ever have before now. How can you make your overall system safer, not only with a finite number of products and projects, but also with strategies that look at your policies that'll then live on forever, regardless of what those future projects are, safety funded or otherwise.
Equity consideration is a required component of an action plan. What can that mean and what can that look like?
I think equity in a safety plan is so important, and yet it's so difficult to do in a way that's transparent and credible, right? To ensure an action plan is equitable, I think the first thing that we have to do is ensure that the tools we're using to create the plan in the first place, in this case, perhaps data sources, are in fact themselves equitable, right?
Yeah.
If your input isn't equitable, your output won't be either. And so it's for that reason that I would encourage any agency looking to implement an analysis to get away from sources that may introduce some form of bias. And so, for example, if we think about connected cars, right, connected vehicle data, that typically is relatively newer cars. And so you could say there's perhaps a bias there. ITS solutions, for example, tend to be limited in their deployment and are generally concentrated around major arterials and significant intersections. So I'm not convinced that's fully representative of all your communities either. And so in my opinion, if you want to have a plan that's truly equitable and you want to have data that's truly equitable and you want to get beyond the unintended biases that may exist in the data sources, have a broad look at, the conditions or how people are using them, regardless of where these roads are, the type of person or the type of car that the person is driving. Combining disparate data sources to create a comprehensive and equitable perspective of mobility is paramount to ensuring equity in your safety plans. Do we have data that represents everyone? Ultimately, that to me is the question. Do we have data that represents everyone? And I think when you have that, then you can start to say that you've taken a big step towards equity.
It is such a wonderful opportunity to address a lot of these entrenched challenges within all of our communities is the specific spotlight on historically disadvantaged communities. So having that as a central piece in our action plans to really think about and reflect on the disproportionate safety challenges that exist in these communities that have just compounded over time. And I know that a number of the implementation grants that were awarded because they specifically laser focus, look at quick builds, look at solutions to increase safety outcomes in historically disadvantaged communities. So, and I think that that's such a critical role for the new wave of data innovation and platform and analysis, and even some of the really innovative approaches that a lot of the consultant community has been championing and have been leading on is how do we build the capacity within public agencies to look and evaluate the true needs of our historically disadvantaged communities. So that is also such a core piece, and I think that has to be fundamental as well in the scopes of work that get developed as agencies go to market with asking and soliciting bids from the community of vendors and consultants, for sure.
And we also need to be sure we're remembering that our historical status quo ways we've done things are not necessarily the gold standard either, right? So we talk a lot about crash data. Our crash databases are based on law enforcement, crash reports. Those in and of themselves are not produced in an equitable manner. You can just imagine in some underserved communities where a crash does occur, different communities are more likely or less likely to have law enforcement enter their community to write a crash report. The number of unreported crashes is not the same in every community or in every city or every area. And that's not only dependent on that, but also dependent on the ability of law enforcement with their limited funding to be able to respond to every crash event that occurs. And there's a lot of noise in the traditional data sources that we've used before. And so even as we're thinking about, man, how do we level set this, or how do we determine what of these new data sources are going to help us identify safety risk in the future? Using the crash history database as this core gold standard is not a great idea either. And yet it is an important source and it is required very specifically under SS4A, right? So we can't ignore it. We can't throw it out. There is value that comes from diving into and understanding the crash database. I've spent most of my career doing that. And as mentioned before, it's not complete, right? So it's something that we need to take a look at. Historically, we've often asked the question in safety planning, what are we going to focus on in this safety plan based on the very limited amount of funding we have to write it? So we have a shoestring budget, whether we're a state DOT or even more so at the local and regional level. How can we get the most good out of this plan in a very short time period often and with a very limited amount of funding? And we don't really, I haven't historically asked the question, what if we had the funding and time that we needed? What would we even do? What would our desired outcomes be? And I think we're in that place now. And I think we have the ability to start asking bigger questions about what do we want to do? And that might take a little bit of help from consultant support or others to help you determine what might make the most sense there. And then in the long term, can you use this, if this is a once in a generation opportunity, can you use this program to develop a safety program, a safety culture in your agency or within your jurisdiction? And what does that look like in terms of even improving safety generationally? What can you do? What kind of innovations can you begin to bring in? As mentioned before, what kind of policies can you truly analyze and potentially modify and change over time? But most importantly, how can you bring this concept of safety as a very important part of how you do business? How does transportation impact education and housing and all the other parts of having a thriving community? saving lives or reducing the pain that comes with traffic crashes is a very important part of that. And so what can we all do together, both on the public side, the private side, the vendor side, to help move safety forward?
The thing that I wanted to touch on is that there is this intense, reluctance or kind of maybe even I'll dare to say fear that this is just a one-time high octane injection of cash, and we cannot rely on it to build sustainable programming in our community. And I think that that is something that going into this should be something that like public sector leaders should start to reject, should start to think about actually how do we use this funding to build capacity within our organization so that I can go to council, I can talk to my executive and start to build the case of building a sustainable and committing funding to a sustainable safety program for years ongoing. I think one of the things that's really powerful about the SS4A is that this amount of funding can be a really self-fulfilling project for a couple of years. And I think that, some of the funding that comes with this action plan grant money should be perceived or should be thought of as like a capacity building, amount of money for my agency, so I can improve and culture shift. Exactly to Brian's point, how can I shift the culture on how we perceive and build programs around safety outcomes for my community?
And even though it is a lot of money for safety planning, $500,000 is not going to save your city, right? And so this is seed money to develop the plan, to get the right people, to develop a culture, to develop a coalition of safety advocates that then takes that over time to very much multiply. That it has to be multiplied by 10x, 100x, 1000x over the next 2 decades in order to make a real difference in communities. We're not going to see some big drop in fatalities in 2025 because of SS4A. That's not how this works. This is an investment in the next generation of making our communities safer.
Do you have any examples of work you've done around kind of equity and helping an agency assess what it means for their community and how that helps to drive their safety plans?
One of the privileges of being at UrbanLogiq is that we have been able to touch a couple dozen, if not a couple hundred of these different layers that governments will working with, because part of our job at UrbanLogiq is to help government wrangle data that they don't have the in-house capacity to be able to do on their own, never mind the in-house tools, et cetera. So everything from demographics, ACS, all the way down to their traffic counts, historical crash data, connected vehicle data, LBS, IoT devices, and everything kind of in between. So UrbanLogiq has had the privilege of being able to get visibility into what each of these layers mean and how they can be used to understand or paint a picture of it, like an integrated picture, I should say, of equity within different communities. One of those examples is actually in the community of the city of San Jose, California. So in city of California, as typical of many emerging or fast, quickly growing metropolitan areas in the United States, is that as development kind of moved outwards throughout the city and people started to live further and further outside the city, and housing prices started to increase in downtown central cores, one of the things that didn't change is road design and speed limits. And so you would get a lot of these communities that were pushed further and further out of the community based on housing prices. But when they went down to the grocery store, they were walking down major arterials, and there would be long distances between intersections, and then they would jaywalk and then they would get hit. These communities didn't have the ability to voice their opinion or voice their situation to the folks that had the power to actually install these changes. So one of the equity pieces that we did was basically measuring this. So we took housing prices, even building density, demographics, and to Brian's point, even historical traffic volumes and traffic speed changes, regardless of crash history. But what we did see in the crash history is that there was an increasing amount of fatalities happening on the outskirts of San Jose, where an increase of population was coming into high risk, high conflict zones with cars more frequently. One of the other things that we found is that there was these communities, because they were being pushed further and further out, there was always at least a 10 to 20 year delay on movement of amenities meeting these communities where they currently live. So we're talking about rec centers, we're talking about sports arenas, we're talking about even grocery stores and playgrounds and childcare centers. those things you really don't catch up to those communities until well after they've established. And so one of the things that we found is that these communities were exceptionally disassociated from the amenities that enrich our daily lives as people who live in these communities, right? So they would have to drive, and not all of them have cars or have the income to be able to purchase a car. And so they would have to find some way to get their kid from school to an after childcare center while working 2 jobs. And that's just, this is the picture of how diving into the equity data can actually help you understand and prescribe much more targeted supports that cross, transportation and safety. And one of the things about this work that was really fulfilling was that not every solution to a safety outcome was a safety treatment. Right? Sometimes it's actually providing funding to childcare centers so that they can move closer to the moms that need them. And so the moms are not getting their car as much, they're not having to drive as far, they don't have to come home late at night when they're tired after working 16 hours to pick up their kid at night, right? So it's having that, how do we build in more nuance into our approach to safety? And I think that's where this equity piece becomes really powerful, because we can talk about equity, like big E equity, in a very esoteric and academic sense, but at the same time we need to talk, what it's really telling us to talk about is the humanitarian aspect of safety, and I think that is going to be such a core piece. And I think hopefully what this action plan does, and this amount of money does, is give people the space and the mental capacity to think about their safety more holistically.
It is real that there are communities that have been underserved and they continue to be underserved. And so that gap continues to spread out. There are communities who have been overserved because they've been squeaky wheels, or because they've just had the ability to go to the public meetings and they have the right people in city council to be able to get what they need for their part of the city. And then other communities just literally don't and haven't, and that gap can continue to widen over time. So I think the ability of SS4A to start trying to address that gap on a transportation safety side of things is important, right? The outcomes of transportation are different based on race, different based on income. The data is there now. We've done that research. We're seeing that. And that absolutely, that gap needs to be addressed. And I think this is a tool, or this is a program that allows us to start addressing that gap. Kind of consider it seed money. It is the money to allow us to build true, robust safety programs that are going to last for years and years to come, hopefully.
Let's start getting some data points to fulfill what our vision is, or to validate what our vision is. If we have to pivot, then we'll pivot, but then and then you can just build from there. And I think one of the pieces that you mentioned, Brian, on just to hang on to the equity idea for one moment, is when you were talking about how certain communities they don't come to town halls, they don't seek out to provide feedback, and this is where the community engagement piece is so fundamentally important. And I was so happy to see it in the SS4A, is that it is encouraging agencies to meet these communities where they are, where they live. Come to them. Don't expect them to come to you. We've seen historically that they have already been very frozen out of this whole process. And so I think having experts in community engagement and having, that human element within this SS4A and the safety planning is imperative for this actual real success, and evening out the playing field a little bit, and how different communities have been differently treated over the years. Given
the SS4A's focus on data with regards to the action plan, a lot of agencies are talking about how can they enhance their current data? What additional data sources can they acquire? Do you have any advice to awardees on where to start and what to consider?
We're fortunate that this comes at a time when we see technology has progressed to a point that we can start to actually bring new relevant insights into the equation. We're all aware that the world is undergoing a data revolution. Digital technology has transformed the world. I don't think anyone will debate that. Many people would say software has already eaten the world. And now we're seeing tools like artificial intelligence and connected devices change the rules as we know them. And certainly we know that this isn't science fiction, right? This is today. And already today solutions exist on the market that can predict where accidents might happen in the future, based off of statistical probabilities using connected data. And to be clear, this again isn't using past crash data or anything of the past, but actual behavioral data. And all of this is made possible through data science, through artificial intelligence. And so indeed, this funding does present a very unique opportunity for agencies who want to go further And I'm going to be a bit bold with my words and say that, if these agencies can go beyond only looking in the past and can start to take advantage of cutting edge technology from the private sector, we can start to look into the future and certainly not wait for the next crash to occur.
Pretty much everyone who applied to an action plan this time around got one. And within that, we're dealing with this whole universe of different agencies at different stages along the data journey, right? There's some that are really sophisticated in thinking about and their approach to data analytics and, work with vendors already that work with, IoT and ITS devices that start with, preemptive warnings or even just quick response when crashes occur. There's that end of the spectrum. And then there's folks that are really just trying to get their feet beneath them around, coming up with a really solid data collection strategy, are really just starting to test the waters of data acquisition purchases. And there's everyone like across that spectrum and in between, right? Going into this and coming up with this action plan strategy, if we're coming down to like real brass tacks, where do I start when I'm trying to come up with like a list of key tasks or priorities in this world of overstimulated and so many, a mind-boggling amount of options, is thinking about reasonable and attainable goals that you can get buy-in within your organization for, and then work backwards. And then I think that comes with being really honest with your team and really looking at the data foundations that you have in place and whether or not it makes sense to start there, because sometimes it's hard to come up with outcomes if you don't actually have a full picture of what's going on in your community. But that exercise of going through this kind of data assessment process, or this when you're really looking inward and thinking about where are my unknown unknowns within my community as far as painting a safety picture within my community, the action plan presents a really wonderful opportunity to use some of that funding to address those gaps. But there's lots of steps that you can take that make this not too scary and overwhelming for folks that are just starting on this journey as well. And there are tons of resources online that can help you work with that. UrbanLogiq has a bunch on our website.
One of the most exciting things about the data analysis part of the SS4A action plans is that I don't know, nobody really knows what that magical combination of data layers is to help us be the most predictive, to identify where and how future fatal and serious injury crashes might occur, so that we can then interrupt that and prevent them, right? That's always been our goal, whether we're looking at past crashes, whether we're looking at volumes, whether implementing the highway safety manual, safety performance functions, and those predictive methodologies. Everything we are trying as safety engineers and analysts to be prognosticators of the future, and then trying to change that future before it occurs. And what I think is cool is that we are all as an industry are going to be figuring out this together over this next year or two. And those who have action plan grants right now, you're going to be on the leading edge of that, of identifying what data sources you should be bringing in, how that data is going to help you make better decisions than any of us have made before. And I think we have better tools than ever to do that. And I think a lot of the work that you all do at Michelin and UrbanLogiq are very much a part of that, is how can we start to bring in these other data sets that can help us be predictive. So this is going to be an ongoing program over the next 5+ years as we continue to learn from each other.
There's a large pot of money available to agencies. A lot of the awardees have a sizable chunk of change that they've been awarded. What new tools, what technologies can they use to improve their action plans?
As this isn't an area where you would normally think of Michelin, I think it's important to understand that safety has always been at the core of Michelin's values and activities. And it's this that has really brought us into the space. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't dive a little bit into the offers that we have. And so two that I would say are relevant to this topic. The first is that we bring together data from more than 40 million connected drivers to understand how drivers are actually interacting with the road. We call this behavioral data. And through this huge amount of data, we're able to understand within any city or county in the United States, the areas where atypical statistical patterns are occurring. And so in other words, we use statistics and data science to identify areas where drivers are exhibiting increased levels of activity that might be undesirable. Things like emergency braking, lane departures, wrong way driving, or having what we perceive as a likely negative interaction with vulnerable road users. And to be clear, we're not identifying when someone spilled coffee on their lap in some random occurrence. we're identifying clusters of activity from many, many events. And then we're able to prioritize that to bring actionable insights to road authorities. The second is a simple and low cost assessment of the road conditions themselves. And so a second solution, I just explained the first. And so in the second, as we talk about low cost assessments for road conditions, in this case, you're using nothing more than a cell phone. And you can transit the roads in your network, in your own vehicles. And through the power of artificial intelligence and computer vision, you can objectively identify what sections of road are most in need of repair. And so these solutions provide, firstly, a measurable, and secondly, actionable, and third, equitable way of assessing the conditions of roads, as well as how people are interacting with the network. And so certainly in the context of SS4A, again, I would say, we've really strive to make these things that are measurable, actionable, and equitable.
To dovetail over what Seth was just talking about, I think what is so exciting about SS4A happening now in the grand scheme of human history is that technology is just an underlying theme. It is no longer a silo. It is no longer something that sits on its own. It has to be integrated or woven into the broader picture. It is something that can no longer be ignored. It presents such a phenomenal opportunity, especially like everyone, like the key buzzword at the moment, again, is artificial intelligence. And how can we use artificial intelligence to not only, do crash prediction and all this fancy stuff, but how do we, how can we leverage it to achieve even more in our day-to-day activities and lives? It might sound corny or cliche at this point, but it is a fundamental piece to all of this. And I think it can start to be used to your advantage. And I think that, especially with the three of us on this webinar today, you have a software data platform, really compelling, exciting data sources, and you have the deep expertise of the consultant community that can help you piece all of these things together into a really comprehensive, modern, like an action plan fit for the 21st century. And I think that is what's so exciting. And back to my theme around capacity building is that there's so many deep expertise out there about how do you chart a pathway or chart a roadmap for capacity building within your agency around safety and around programming. Within UrbanLogiq, what we do is we're focused on bringing in all the data that you already have at your fingertips, leveraging the most of Michelin data, as well as others, as well as tapping in the resources and expertise of Brian and his team, so that we can paint that dynamic picture of your community and how these different pieces all play together towards a really comprehensive safety plan. So I think you're spoiled for choice as far as the technology that is available today. And so I believe it is incumbent upon agencies to really think about how technology plays a piece within this action plan.
I would encourage you to just be creative, to go through the exercise of thinking through. There's a core kind of stuff you must do, right? There's some core elements of safety planning that are not going to change. I think the technologies that have been discussed are going to help us do that better. We're going to answer those questions better. We're going to be able to be more predictive. We're going to do a better job with that same kind of heart and passion that we've had for this role as safety planners for a long time. And so I would very much encourage everyone to just think about ways that you can use new tools, new methodologies, new data sets. But also, if you're part of this webinar today and you didn't apply in the first year for SS4A, I would absolutely encourage you to apply in year 2 for an action plan, because you're going to get the value of all of us who are doing this the first time. We're going to mess up. We're not going to do it perfectly, right? We're going to learn a lot in the first year of this program. And as we're all doing this the first year, you're going to get to use what we've learned to then have a second round of action plans a year from now and following that are even better than the first. And I think that's fantastic. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's all of us trying to figure out how we can do this better. And we're going to continue now. We have an ability to do hundreds of these plans this year together and learn from each other as we do it. And there's going to be lots of different tools to use, lots of different data sets and their combinations. And I think that's great. I think it's going to be fun to really see how we can start to become better at that prediction that we continue to be asked to do. I think my final last piece of advice for any agency that's moving forward, either right now with your SS4A action plan or looking to the future, is find a trusted advisor. If you're going to have, whether that's someone within your agency or partner agencies, working with peers, either within your state or around the country, organizations that do help you with this work, whether it's the FHWA themselves or ITE, the Vision Zero Network, other folks who are very much about this work of safety planning. And then potentially consultant support like us at DKS. We've been doing safety planning forever. Our company's over 40 years old, and this is the work that we do. Maybe a small caution, which I realize is a little bit self-serving, is that there will be companies popping up, people popping up who are going to tell you that they're safety experts. Just vet their resumes, make sure that they've actually done this work in real life. Many of us have, so there's a lot of people that do this work. There's a lot of great folks in the consulting world who are good at safety planning. I can't do 475 safety plans anyway, so I don't need every one of you to hire DKS to do your work. But I would say it's important to have someone on that team supporting your work who knows you, but also knows safety and knows how to do safety planning and safety analysis.
I would encourage you to be bold and creative. Go beyond the historical solutions. This is a chance to do something different, to make a step change for your agency and your community. So certainly, I would say this is, as we all know, this is not an opportunity to be wasted. And so certainly thank you for having me. It was a true honor to be on the panel. I very much appreciate the opportunity to have spoken to you all today. And I hope that I was able to bring value to the audience and hope that we're able to connect again in the future.
One of the themes that I would implore the agency community that are listening is the theme of partnership and the thing of, doing things together and reaching across and talking to people you wouldn't necessarily have thought to talk to in your discovery, in your prioritization of the eligible activities or the things that will really move the dial for your community. So in addition to creativity, in addition to trusting and developing trust with your vendors and with your consultant partners, is to foster this culture of partnership and thinking about safety as truly that team sport. We're all in this together. We all truly want to leverage this opportunity to its fullest extent to, at the end of the day, save lives. And that's why we're all here. And so I think that this presents such an opportunity to do that. And I think that, you don't have to figure out everything on your own. All of us are going through this together. We're all figuring this out for the first time. So just reach out. We will chat. We will help you, walk you through these things. There's so many resources online, and we will help you find the right resources that you actually need so you're not swimming in too much information. And I think just from here on out, it's all outcomes driven. So be honest, be introspective about what these outcomes should be. Fight for your community, fight for space, and at the end of the day, to leverage this opportunity. And if you haven't already, then please do so in the future. It's exceptionally worth it, and it will make a difference.
Well, that's it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any additional questions that we didn't address or go through in this discussion, let us know and we'll follow up with you.